these are the materials I'll be using in today's lesson. You can find a list of these materials in the video description down below. So feel free to pause the video and gather your supplies. The only really unique item is this bleed-proof white paint. I like it for adding those finishing details. Otherwise, let's just jump right in. These are the paint colors I'll be using in today's lesson. You don't need these exact colors, just use what you have and get somewhere close. If you do wish to know which exact colors I am using today, pause the video and go to the video description where I've listed them out. Also in the video description is a reference photo as well as a line drawing that you can download and print at home. I want you to print the line drawing at the scale you wish to paint it. I'm choosing to do this piece on a small 5x7 scale. We're going to do a transfer using this line drawing. In order to do that, on the back of your line drawing, you simply apply graphite using the side profile of a pencil all over the back. Once you've done that, you can tape it directly onto your watercolor paper so the graphite is touching the top surface, and then take a ballpoint pen, and with just the pressure of your pen tracing this line drawing, it will actually transfer the lines to your watercolor paper. I simply recommend that after you start tracing a short distance, take a moment to peek, and I want you to make sure that your lines are not coming out too black. We want just a nice medium gray tone. That way we can control whether or not the lines are going to show up in our finished painting. Another alternative is if you have graphite paper at home, you could also use this. If you use graphite paper, you simply slip it in between. You would no longer have to apply graphite to the back of the drawing, and then you trace. I've already traced this image in advance because I have limited time today. So I'm just going to pull this line drawing off, and you can see that I have all the necessary lines I want. You can also notice that I didn't trace absolutely everything. So trace what you feel is necessary. You don't have to trace absolutely everything. Now that I have the line drawing on my paper, I want to take a look at some of these lines and lighten up any of the lines that I feel like might show through my paints. Because watercolor paints are translucent, and the last thing I want is real dark black lines to show up, especially on these white petals. So I plan on doing a bold, dark background. So I'm not so concerned about the pencil lines that touch the background. I'm more concerned about the pencil lines that are in between two white petals. Those are the ones that will show up in a finished painting. So I just want to be mindful of those, especially these ones in the front. I want to lighten those up really good. I can also use a kneaded eraser to just erase like a traditional eraser to get rid of any smudge marks that might have occurred just from your hand resting during the transferring process. All right, a lot of the details related to the bumblebee, there's quite a few darks in there, so I don't feel the need to lighten all of those. The area in the center of the flower, when I get to it, I might lift some of that out. So to begin, I want to actually start off with painting just some of the soft values in the petals. So I'm going to be mixing up just a really soft purple gray color. So I can get just a little bit of color and texture to these petals so that they don't just look flat. Now, the reason I'm choosing to paint the white petals first is around them are a lot of really dark colors. I find that if I paint the real dark background first, if I accidentally bump the background colors while trying to paint the petals, I could pull some of that dark color into my white petals, contaminating them. So for this particular subject, I am going to choose to do the white petals first, and the background will be afterwards. So I'm going to get a large number 10 round, and I'm just going to get my brush nice and wet. And I'm going to let my brush hold as much clean water as I can, and I'm going to bring it over to my palette. And I'm going to wipe it off on the rim of my palette. I'm going to do that a couple times because I want a lighter, softer pastel color. So for that reason, I need more water and less paint. So I'm doing that in a couple different wells because I want a couple different values for the shadows. So for this first one, I'm going to use a small amount of Payne's Gray. And then I'm going to add just a little bit of the Purple Lake. And I did select Dioxine Purple as one of the colors I'll be using. However, I don't want to use that on my white petals because it is a staining pigment. And if I accidentally go too wide with my shadow colors, it would actually really dominate and stick around. I wouldn't be able to lift it or erase mistakes. So I'm staying away from that Dioxine Purple. So right now I'm just testing out my color on a scrap piece of paper. And this feels a little dark to me. So I'm going to get some water, bring some more water over to that mixture of Payne's Gray and Purple Lake. And I'm just going to add enough water to soften the value. Now, anytime I test the color, I really make sure to wipe my brush off on the rim to remove any excess paint before I go to my scrap paper. I feel like that is getting close. I might actually pull some of this aside and make an even lighter version. I like to have a range of values in my paintings. So I'm just pulling some of that aside into a separate well. That way I can water it down even further for an additional lighter value. Okay, so right now I have two values, one that's really light, one that's a little bit more moderate. And I'm going to now mix up a third color. This is going to be just more of a soft blue. So I'm going to use that ultramarine blue. And I'm going to add just the tiniest bit of Purple Lake to it. I'm trying to make kind of a periwinkle. And I like that color. So it's nice and soft, not too dark. And I'm just going to go ahead and begin with that. So now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. If you have difficulty making small line work with a number 6 round, you can switch to something smaller. But I think sometimes as long as you use a light touch, a larger brush just allows you to get further faster. So I've gotten this brush wet. I'm just going to dab my sponge. So I'm kind of removing that excess water. And I'm going to start with the lightest purple and gray mixture. But notice how I'm wiping it off on the rim really well, so it's only semi-loaded. I'm now going to begin adding some color to some petals. So I'm just kind of coming to this back petal here. And I'm just going to add some creases. And I think I'm just going to focus on adding creases to each petal first, and then I can come back and start pushing some of the values and adding variations. My brush started running out of paint, so I'm going to re-dip it. I'm loading it really nice and well at the beginning, but then I always wipe it off on the rim to remove any of that excess paint. I could even do a light tap on a sponge or paper towel. The reason I'm removing that excess paint is because I don't want puddles of paint on my paper. I want to just kind of create a nice thin glaze. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. And we have a couple petals in the background. Looks like one of them or a couple of them I might be missing. So I am just going to come in here with a pencil and draw some of the missing petals. They should be just a smidge taller than the last one. And then I also want one right behind the bee here. I'm going to add some petal texture to them as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the slightly darker purple to establish some shadows that are going on. Actually, I'm going to stick with the lighter one. So I'm staying with the same real soft purple, and there's a couple shadows I want to establish. So one is coming from the bottom here, created by this forward petal, and it makes the shadow kind of lay across this petal from the background flower. And I'm just going to let that shadow dry. There's another shadow that is in between the petals here that we can only kind of see a sliver of that shadow. So it's kind of this long triangular shape. It's quite a bit of shadow in between these two forward petals. If there's any puddling of paint, I just dry my brush off on a sponge, and then I use my dry brush to soak up the puddling of paint, just to make it easier to control. And then this petal here is creating a shadow on the petal that's just behind it. So I'm just going to come in here add some color. That petal itself is creating a shadow on the petal behind it. So I'm just going to the left edge. We have another shadow over here that we need to paint in. The bee's wing is actually creating a shadow on this petal. So I'm going to bring that shadow right up to the wing without touching the wing. And some of that shadow might just kind of soften as it extends on the opposite side. Now here I have some, petal texture that I did, and it ended up being a little too wide. So I'm going to do some lifting. It's with a square brush. I'm going to get it wet with clean water, and then I use my fingers like a squeegee because there's little droplets of water that are hanging out on the metal ferrule here. And I'm just going to use my fingers across that square just to wipe them away, but I don't want the brush wet. Or I don't want it dry. I still want to keep the brush wet. Now I can go into any areas where I feel like, maybe that got a little wide. And because Purple Lake doesn't stain as bad as dioxazine purple, I can actually do some lifting. So by just moving this stiff square brush back and forth across the area, I can actually lift some of that color and thin it out. So if there's any areas where your petal texture maybe got a little wide, or maybe it just feels heavy and you want to soften it, you can use a stiff square brush to kind of control some of the colors. Now I am going to be switching to a number 2 round to continue with some of the petal texture. Now I like the idea of having some additional colors in my petal values. So I'm going to use that periwinkle blue that I mixed up, but I need to soften it a bit because I want to move real slow with my values when I'm working with white. So I'm just kind of testing out my colors, seeing if I like them. And this is the value I'm working with. So very, very light, just a soft, soft glaze. And with my small brush, I can now go in to some of these petals and just add some real soft values so they don't read flat. So I like the idea of some parts of the petal being bright white and leaving it as, just the white paper. However, there are other areas of the petal that are more in shadow. So I want to kind of add some value, even if it's just super, super light. And sometimes I drag my brush in a line. Sometimes I dot my brush. So I kind of make little groupings of dots and create texture. It doesn't have to be super smooth and perfect. So I'm just looking for areas on the petals that read more in shadow. Now this forward petal here, I want to create a shadow on the back petal. However, my line work is a little off. So I am going to choose to just modify my pencil drawing just a smidge. And maybe I want this petal here to have just a little bit more width. So I'm just kind of reestablishing that edge. And once the paint that I just put nearby dries, I can kind of soften that color there. But for now, I'll just move on with pushing some of the values. So the petals that are in the foreground here are a little bit backlit. So I'm just coming in and adding a little bit of color to them so they don't camouflage into the petals behind. But I'm using that really watered down periwinkle. So the color I'm adding is real subtle, but it will make a difference. I find that tapping my brush and allowing there to be some imperfections in my brushwork actually adds to the texture of my petals. So I'm not trying to be super perfect about it. And we don't want puddling of paint. So if we're overloading our brush, we're going to see puddles. We got to watch that. The downside of puddles is the way they dry, they have that built up pigment on the outside edge of the shape. So try and soak up any of those puddles before you move on. Just take it one petal at a time. Now, the center of this flower is creating quite a few shadows on the left petals. Now, the shadow is going to stay pretty close to the flower because it's coming from a pretty strong upward angle. So these shadows are going to be real short. They're not going to be too long. So for these shadows, I am going to be using that darker purple and gray mixture. I'm going to start off by coming in and establishing where the edge of the center is. And then I want to come in here and I'm basically going to start off by kind of filling in. But then the shadow needs to kind of move in an upward angle, creating little wispy lines, which kind of follow the texture of the center of that flower. So they're just kind of short, but I'm kind of pulling them up, following the contour of the petal. And some of these shadows might continue over on this left edge here. Now, the bumblebee itself is also creating a shadow on the white petals. So right below its butt, we want to establish some shadows there too. So I'm going to come in and find the edge of the center of the flower again. And then these shadows are going to also move up and follow the direction of the petal. All right, this pencil line here, I need to lighten, so I'm going to use my kneaded eraser and just soften that a bit. And this is where things start to feel a little risky. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be creating some glazes on some of parts of the petals to better define which petal is forward and which petal is back. There's a pretty strong shadow here on the left, though, that I forgot being created by this petal. So I just want to come in here and create that shadow real fast. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Okay. I am going to get, let's see, what color do I want to use for this? I'm going to go with just a really, really soft purple gray again. I'm going to test out my color, make sure it's just a real soft glaze. I think that might be a little strong, so I'm going to add a little water to it. I feel like that's a little better. So just something real nice and light. Okay, so now I need to just go into each area to better define which petal is in front and which one is in back. So these petals here in the very front, I feel like they're standing out fairly good. I might want to kick up some of these shadows a bit by just adding some value on top of the shadows. I don't like leaving puddles, so I'm going to soak up some of that color. And the way I do that is I dry my brush off on my sponge and soak it up. Okay, now when we get over to this side here, I need this long petal in the corner to read as if it's overlapping the petal that's behind it. So to do that, I'm going to do a glaze right next to its edge, just so it looks like it's on top of that white petal. And I don't let those puddles sit. I soak those up. Now the next petal is actually in front of that back petal, so I'm going to be doing the opposite. I'm going to be going above my pencil line on that edge. So I can better define which petal's in front. Soaking up those puddles. Now, this forward petal is a little bit backlit, and I don't want the edges between these two petals to camouflage with each other. So on the forward petal in this corner, I'm going to add just a real soft glaze, so it kind of reads a slightly different color. I'm coming back over to the right side, and this center petal here is in front of both these bottom petals. So I'm just going to add some darker shadow color in this area to give it better definition. So I'm using the darker purple gray mixture for this one. Now I want the edge between the two petals on the right middle. Right now, everything's kind of camouflaging in with each other. So I want to use that really light glaze of purple that I mixed up most recently. And I want to put a glaze on the one that's behind. Now these two petals down below are kind of having a camouflaged edge again as well. So as long as those pencil lines are nice and light so they don't show through, I can add a glaze to the one that's in the back, just to push it back just a little bit. Now this petal with the strong shadow on it, I do not put any texture in there. So I'm going to get some petal texture added. So just adding a couple lines. making those lines pop out on the opposite side. And I want to use that really, really light glaze of purple gray. And I'm just going to add a small glaze of color to this background petal, so there's some separation there. Okay, it's pretty easy to kind of fuss around with petals forever. I want us to move on to the yellow of the center of the flower. So for that, I need to use my large round square or my large round brush. This is my number 10. I'm going to find some new areas on my palette so I can put some water in. And I want to get some of that cadmium yellow into that water. I'm also going to make a second color, which will have some of that burnt sienna to make kind of a darker color. And if I want that to appear a little bit more earthy, I can add the tiniest bit of blue to it. So I did, 75% of that burnt sienna, which is the tiniest bit of blue, so it's more earthy. And if I want an orange, I'm going to put a small amount of water in a new well, and I'm going to use that permanent rose. This is a color I'll be using in the background eventually. But for making color harmony, I'm going to add some yellow to that permanent rose to create a really pretty yellow-orange color. Okay. Before I begin painting, I want to test out my colors. So I'm going to thoroughly dip in my yellow and I'm going to test it out. That feels really light to me, so I am going to get some more pigment so it's a little more vibrant. That feels better. I'm now rinsing my brush and drying it off on my sponge. I'm going to get some of that burnt sienna with the blue, test that out. That feels a little light to me, so I'm going to get more pigment into that mixture because our watercolors are going to dry to be about 20% lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So I do want a more vibrant color there. Okay, that feels more vibrant. And then lastly, I'm going to check out my orange. And I like that color as well. Okay. Now that I feel okay about my colors, I'm going to come in and add some water to the center of the flower. The reason I'm choosing to paint the center of the flower first is because the bee consists of so many dark colors in comparison that if I accidentally get some yellow on parts of this bumblebee, it's not going to mess anything up. So I can actually put water right over top of parts of the bumblebee and not worry about it. So I'm just softening some of my pencil lines that are around the outer edge of my yellow. And I'm going to soften up some of the texture lines in the center there. Because I don't want these strong blacks to be showing up. All right, so I'm going to add a very thin amount of water. I don't want a huge amount because I don't want my colors to be diluted too much. I want some vibrancy. As I get closer to the petals, I really try to slow down so I don't accidentally put color inside the white petals in the foreground. Any areas where I feel like it's drying too fast, I just tap my brush so my brush kind of releases some of the color or some of the water that it's holding. Again, you can tell I'm not worried about hitting the legs of the bee because those are going to be such a darker color later. All right, so I'm going to tip my paper so you can see where the water is. I have some puddling on the right that I need to get rid of. So I'm going to dry my brush and soak up that puddle of water using my dry brush. But everything else looks nice and glossy and keeping the water thin. Now using a dry brush, I'm going to grab some of that yellow and I'm going to put this yellow all over for now. If there is some puddling of paint, I can just dry my brush on my sponge, come into some of these puddles and soak it up using my dry brush. Now, while things are wet, I'm switching to my small number 2 round, and I want to get some darker colors under the bee. So I'm going to use that orange to add some color underneath the bee because the bee's creating a shadow. So I'm kind of blending the orange with the yellow on the surface here. If you're having a hard time controlling how far your orange paint is going, you can just dry your brush off on a sponge or paper towel, and then with that dry brush, you can come back to your flower and kind of soak up some of the excess paint and push it around and have more control over where it goes. Now I'm going to rinse my brush really good, dry it off so I don't dilute my color, and I'm going to grab some of that brown mixture. And closest to the bee, I want to darken it up even further still. Now for texture purposes, I'm going to mix some yellow with purple on my palette here so I can make more of a golden yellow. So I'm going right into my cadmium paint. I'm going to then rinse my brush. I'm going to go right into my purple lake. And I want it to be about 75% yellow and just a small amount of Purple Lake. So this is that golden color I'm going for. Really reads like a yellow ochre, so if you just want to go straight to yellow ochre, you can. But while this is wet, I'm going to be tapping this golden yellow into areas of this flower. And I can even draw like little half circles. But I just want a little bit more variation in the color. I want to try and capture some of that texture without necessarily having to paint all of it. This is still just our first layer, so we'll have opportunity to improve on this. But I think it's always good to kind of capture some texture during the stage of wet into wet if you can manage it. If I feel like some of my color got a little dark, I can always come in with a clean, practically dry brush. And before this yellow dries, I can soak up some of the paint, and that will help brighten things. I'm going to use just a little bit of this Payne's Gray. And I'm going to add some of that brown mixture that we made with the burnt sienna. And underneath that bee, really close to the body, sticking more to the right, I'm just going to add more shadow. All right, I feel like that needs some time to dry, so I can actually bring some of my attention to the bee itself. So there's a few areas of the bee that kind of have that yellow stripe. So in those areas, I just want to be mindful of any pencil lines, and I'm just lightening those up so there's less chance of them showing in the finished painting. And I'm not doing a wet into wet technique on this one. I'm just using my number 6 round, and I'm going to grab some of that cadmium yellow paint, and I just want to get a base color. And I'm not bringing the color right up to the top. Instead, I'm going to just rinse my brush and use a wet, clean brush to pull some of that color up, creating some fuzz-like textures. I'm going to do the same thing in the back. I'm going to keep the yellows pretty close to the leg and the torso, and then I'm going to rinse my brush. And with a clean, wet brush, I'm going to pull some of those yellows out towards the edge, creating some fuzzy texture, just to get a softer yellow there. All right, I need to give this painting some time to dry. If you're impatient like me, you have a blow dryer nearby. So I'm going to pause, dry it, and get back to you. Now that everything is completely dry, I'm going to begin working on the background. For this, I don't want to accidentally put my background colors onto a white petal, so I'm going to be using some masking fluid. Before I apply the masking fluid, I'm going to make sure I've erased any of the smudges that might be there. And in order to protect my tools, I am going to put a small amount of dish soap in a cup of water. And this will allow me to protect my brush. So with this soap, thoroughly soak your brush in the soapy water, and this provides a layer of protection on your brush. Now we're going to go into masking fluid, and this is going to have a thin plastic finish that resists the paint. So just like masking tape that you use to keep your house paint out of certain areas when you're painting a room, this is going to keep paint out of certain areas on your painting. So I am going to apply it directly on to the surface of my petals right up to the edge. Now, masking fluid is the way you apply it is so important. It is just as important as paint. So really take your time. Do not rush it. Try your best to kind of create soft, clean edges where things are not bumpy or, crooked. Do not rush the masking fluid step. When I get to the yellow of the bee, I'm going to apply my masking fluid with more texture so it looks fuzzy. So I didn't create a smooth edge. The only time I create a smooth edge is when I am near a petal. So I'm just applying it to anything that is kind of sharing an edge with the background. I don't have to apply it everywhere else. But this dark background will help make this flower really pop out. I'm not happy with how I applied masking fluid there. So when it dries, I'm probably going to lift and peel it up before I paint my background. So I'll be showing you how to do that as well. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. We have just a couple slivers of some background showing on the left. So I'm just kind of making sure I'm protecting the petals that are nearby. I need to rinse my brush occasionally in soapy water just to protect it. All right, I think I am pretty close. Okay, so the masking fluid I applied here on this petal didn't quite go as planned. I went a little too wide. So I'm going to actually lift it up by just using the pressure of my finger. And I only do this after it dries. But you can see that it just kind of peels up and flakes away. And then any of those flakes I can just blow away or brush them away with my fingers. And I can now reapply the masking fluid and just be a little bit more careful so it doesn't go outside my petal shape. I make sure to rinse my brush in the soapy water really well after masking fluid, so no masking fluid is left in there. If masking fluid has a chance to dry on your brush, it will ruin it. And then I take an additional step of rinsing my brush real well in clean water because soapy water does not mix well or react well with watercolors. So there's a couple areas where some masking fluid dropped or dripped in my background. So I'm just kind of peeling up those little dots real quick. Okay. So anytime you might think that there's a little bit of masking fluid hanging out and you're concerned that it may not all be erased, you can use a little tool called a rubber cement pickup. It's just a small square rubber block. Looks like this. And since I suspect that there is a thin bit of masking fluid in this corner that I just can't get with my fingers, I use this just for peace of mind. Okay, so while that masking fluid is drying, I'm going to mix up my background colors. I'm going to switch back to my large round number 10. I'm fairly done with most of my petal colors, so I can actually just use them to begin mixing some paint into. So one of the background colors I want is a vibrant permanent rose pink. Another color I would like is that darker dioxazine purple. I never know if I'm pronouncing that right. And then lastly, I do want some of that ultramarine blue. So I'm going to test out all my colors. I want my blue to be more vibrant than that, so I'm going to add more pigment. That feels better. I'm going to rinse my brush and test my dark purple. I want that to be more vibrant as well. That feels better. And then I'm going to test that pink. And that pink looks good. All right. So this edge of my petal is still wet with masking fluid. I'm going to hit that with a blow dryer so I can begin painting. Now that my masking fluid's completely dry, I'm going to apply a thin amount of water to the background. If the water hits the masking fluid, I'm not worried about it at all. I just don't want to go past the masking fluid and accidentally hit my petals. I'm being pretty heavy-handed with my water on this initial pass, just because I know that it's going to absorb into the paper pretty quickly. I am going to apply water to the thin little areas between the petals on the right. I'm not so much worried about the left just yet. All right, and want to make sure everything is glossy and staying wet. As you see me tip the paper, you can see where I applied my water and how wet it is. However, notice that there's no puddles. So the water, although very wet, there's no puddles. If there are puddles, just dry your brush on a sponge or paper towel and pick up some of that excess water. Otherwise, it'll dilute your color by a lot. So I'm now going to get some of that pink on my brush. And I'm just going to randomly apply this into some areas where maybe I want some pinks. I'm trying to make sure that the shapes I create are not all the same, and I don't want them evenly spaced either. I'm rinsing the pink out of my brush. I'm drying my brush on a sponge before I dip into, I think I'm going to go with my purple. No, let's go with blues next. Move slow with your brush so you don't accidentally splash your white petals with your dark background colors. I'm now going to grab some of that dark purple. And I'm just going to try and apply this purple in some of the areas that are still white. Keeping in mind that I still plan on doing some blending in the background right on the wet surface. So I'm not too worried about, being exact with my shapes. And every background can look a little different. That's totally fine. So now that everything is covered in color, I want to remove some of the excess puddling of paint. So I dry my brush and I'm just soaking up some of the puddling of paint that is along the edges or the low points in the paper. Now that I've removed some of the excess paint, I can now focus on blending and working on some of the shapes that are in my background. So anything that looks too much like a circle, I try to just kind of give it more of an organic shape. But I don't want to completely lose some of the unique shapes that I've created. So I feel like I'm pretty good with how the background is looking now. If there's any areas where I want it to be more vibrant, I can dip right into my paint. And I can choose to add a splash of more vibrant color if I wish. You're going to see some texture where the paint kind of settles in between the texture of the paper you're using. And you may or may not like it. However, it's a result of using the ultramarine blue, because ultramarine blue is a granulating color. So it naturally wants to kind of create a texture when it's drying. And since we've mixed that with other colors, you're going to see that texture throughout the background, but I think it's really kind of a fun effect. I am going to paint wet on dry into the couple narrow spaces of background on the left to really push my colors dark. I might stack some of my colors. I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's Gray to parts of my background just to darken it up a bit. I can add some of my purple to it if I want. And you don't have to add the Payne's Gray if you don't want. It's completely optional. Okay, so I now need to let that background dry, and I can revert my attention to focusing on the center of the flower. Everything there has dried. So as long as I am mindful of where I rest my hand so I don't smear that wet background paint, I can just move forward with painting. If you're concerned about smearing the background, do blow dry it so you have peace of mind. Okay, I am going to get that golden color that we used for texture, where we added purple to our yellow. And I'm going to make that a little darker by adding some additional purple to it. I want to kind of create a brownish gold color. And I'm going to come in to the center of the flower, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see this a little better. And I want to come in and kind of create some gaps that might be in between the pollen. So I'm just kind of doing little curved lines, kind of thinking of a rooftop. I know that sounds kind of strange, but almost like layered shingles. And I don't want them all to connect, but I just want to kind of imply some texture here without having to paint absolutely everything. If I hit the bee's legs, I don't worry about it. So by just kind of creating these curved lines, I can kind of give the hint of what's going on in the center here. Don't overload your brush. If you do, it's going to be very hard to get those smaller lines. If you have too much paint on your brush, it's going to want to release a lot of paint, giving you really thick lines. So just be cautious of that. I'm going to soak up any puddling of paint that are a result of this flower texture in the center. And then I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer. Now that everything is completely dry, I can use that rubber cement pickup to remove the masking fluid. And I just drag it across my paper like I would an eraser. And as long as your background is completely dry, it'll come right up and it won't smear anything. Now, this is a result of some masking fluid being left behind when I kind of pulled up my first attempt. So I'll just have to clean up the background in that area. So just take a moment to remove all the masking fluid and then we can continue painting. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. To correct the areas in the background where there's a little bit of masking fluid there that the background paint didn't get to, I'm just going to take my paint and paint wet on dry over top of that area. And then while it's wet, I'm going to rinse my brush, tap my sponge so it's only lightly damp, and then I'm going to go to the outside edge of that brush stroke using feather light pressure to just soften that edge so it kind of blends once it's dry. I'm going to do the same thing over here, but in order to reach it comfortably, I'm just going to switch my painting around so I can access that area without fear of hitting the flower petal. And then again with feather light pressure, I'm going to rinse my brush, lightly tap my sponge, stay on the outside edge of that paint stroke, and I'm just going to add a little bit of water to soften that edge. That way when it dries, it's less noticeable that I fixed a mistake there. Now I'm going to bring my attention to the bee. As you can see, when I was removing the masking fluid, the rubber cement pickup kind of smeared some of my pencil lines there. So I'm going to take this opportunity to lighten some of these graphite lines, and then I can redraw some of these details just using my pencil. I'm just referring to the line drawing as I do it, but I can kind of reestablish where the eye is, where the head is. Trying to figure out where the original antennas were. And then we had a foot over here. I don't know if it's called a tongue, but it's kind of like the little tongue coming down to soak up the nectar. And I feel like that's about all the details I need. I'm just going to kind of reestablish maybe some of the leg components that got covered up with paint. I know they're going to be black, so I'll be able to just paint right over this. Okay. Now I'm going to use my large round brush to begin mixing some of the paint colors I want for this bee. Now I'm going to want a really nice rich black. However, Payne's Gray has a bit of a blue hue to it. So to counteract that, I will be adding some of that burnt sienna, so it's a warmer tone. So initially, when I mix up my Payne's Gray, it's pretty dark, okay? But I'm now going to add additional burnt sienna to it so I can make it warmer and make it look like just a really dark brown, kind of like a sepia color. So there's less blue in it. And you can't even tell. I'm going to do a little bit more. And it makes it look more like a traditional black. So you can kind of see the color difference here. Once I have that color down the way I want, I also want to mix up a kind of more of a traditional brown using that burnt sienna, but I'll just add a small amount of Payne's Gray so it looks more like a burnt umber. I'll also still want to have some light grays because I always want a range of color. So some of my grays won't be too dark. So something nice and light. And I think that's a good enough place to stop. So I really just mixed up some blacks and some dark browns to work on the Bumblebee. Okay, so for this, I am going to wet almost everything on the Bumblebee. So I'm going to start with the head. And I'm just working with clean water here. Being mindful that the white behind the head is actually part of a petal. So I don't want to accidentally make the mistake of thinking that's part of the bee that I need to wet. So right now the water on my paper is standing in a pretty significant puddle. I'm trying to find an angle so you can see that there. I need to soak up some of that excess water before I bring my paint in. Otherwise, it's just going to be so diluted and watered down. I'm not going to get the vibrancy I want. But I do want the water in there just so I have the ability to kind of play with my colors a bit longer. So I'm switching to my number 2 round. And I'm going to start with my cadmium yellow. I know that seems weird. However, when some of this bee's fur or hairs are backlit, it kind of comes off yellow. So I'm making a point to go around the bottom edge using little hair-like textures to kind of imply some of this yellow fuzz that may be in there. There's some areas where I'm going to want some of this fuzz, but I can't kind of get the effects I want with overlaying on the background. So I might have to utilize some of that bleed-proof white to get some of the additional effects that I want. So I'm keeping these little hair-like textures. Now that I've gone around the outside edges of the head using some yellow, I'm now going to get some of that dark brown, okay? And I'm just kind of keeping it central. It's going to be pretty easy to lose my pencil line, so if I have to redraw them again, I'm not going to worry about it. But notice how I'm, even with this brown, I'm kind of doing hair-like textures that lead into the yellows. but I'm just trying my best not to completely cover up all the yellow. So I'm not going as far, and my brush isn't very loaded with paint. Now, I don't want to cover up all the yellow in the next section of the body, so I'm trying to be very mindful of how far I go with my brush strokes, keeping them nice and short so I don't cover up too much in there. Now I'm going to grab the black and I just want to get some black color in here. And I'm kind of doing the same thing, staying away from that outside edge, trying to keep the darkest part more central. Now I'm going to let that area dry and I'm going to move on to the next section. However, I need to be mindful of the wing of the bee. I don't want to completely cover up the wing. So if I need to, I could apply some masking fluid here. But if I just redraw some of its elements, it can kind of help remind me not to paint over it. All right, so I'm going to go towards the top back of the bee, keeping water out of the wing. And being mindful that I don't want my water to go inside those white petals. So I'm going to tip my paper so you can see where I applied the water. Now I'm going to go in with the brown this time. And I'm going to create those hair-like textures just along the top, keeping them nice and short because I don't want to completely cover up that white petal that is back there. So I have some browns down. I'm now going to get some of those dark blacks. And I'm going to stay away from the outside edge because I don't want to completely cover up all those light browns. I like the idea of some light kind of showing from behind the bee. So I'm just kind of keeping the blacks more central. I'm now going to take some water to the midsection of the bee, but below the wing. So by breaking up the subject into just small sections like this, it kind of makes it far more digestible and takes some of the pressure off. So don't, jump in with too much. It's okay to just take it in small little chunks. So you can tell that I'm using my dirty water to wet this area of the body so you can easily kind of see where I'm applying the color or where I'm applying the water. So this is just my dirty water, but I don't mind using it because it allows me to more easily see where I'm applying my water at. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. All right, I'm going to start with some of my yellow. I'm going to tip my paper so you can see where it is wet. It's just a thin amount of water, so I don't have a lot of working time. But I do want some yellow at the top of some of the leg joints so I can create contrast later. There is some yellow fuzz along some of the edges of the leg. So I'm just kind of putting in some yellow. Now I'm going to grab some of that dark brown and I'm trying to just watch the fuzz direction or hair direction on the bumblebee because that's going to help. And I don't want to go too far into these yellows because I don't want to completely lose them. I'm just working this in stages, knowing that I'll be able to do an additional layer. When I get close to the yellow back section, I'm being mindful to do short strokes so I don't completely lose all those yellows. And then before I move on to the next section, I'm just going to add little bits of black, keeping away from those yellow sections of the joints that I want to maintain. And I can come back into this later to add more details. I know right now it looks really funky. I also want to add some browns to the very center of the legs. This leg was already dry, so I just kind of stopped midway. Since it's dry, I'm going to have some hard edges on it, but that's okay. I'm now going to take my dirty water and wet this back black stripe on my bee. I'm being mindful of the wet area that is brown. I'm staying away from that. I'm not coming in contact with it. I'm also being mindful of that wing. I don't want to accidentally cover it up. So when I tip my paper, you can see where that water is. I'm going to start with my browns. After I get some browns in there and notice how I, maintained those little fuzzy textures, I'm then going to get some of the dark blacks. And I'm not bringing them all the way to the bottom. I want some of these browns to show up. So I'm just kind of staying through the center. And I'm going to let that dry. Now in the next area, I'm going to paint some of the fuzz using some really watered down gray. So I don't want this to be too dark. So I need to water this down quite a bit more. And that looks about right. I could even add just a small amount of brown to it. And I like that color there. So with that color, I'm going to go in to the bottom section of my bee, and I'm painting wet on dry. And I'm just creating little hair-like textures that kind of follow the contour of the bee. And I'm trying to allow some negative space in between so it looks like there's little white furs. And that's about all I can do. I need to let that dry. So meanwhile, I'm going to go back to the front of my bee. That area has dried, and I'm going to start adding details. So I'm going to grab that really dark black, and I'm just going to define where the antenna is. So there's one in the back here that comes down onto the forehead, and it doesn't go far into the forehead because it's on the back section of the head. And then I have an antenna that kind of comes down just before the center of the flower and comes up and then stops kind of on the forehead. So notice where the lines meet up. Okay, that's going to help give you a reference. The eye is right behind that antenna. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to identify where I want that bumblebee's eye to be. We then have some details on the lower head of the bee, but I don't know the proper terms of these components. So I'm just going to kind of paint what I see. These look like little feelers of some sort. And then we have some sort of tongue gathering the nectar. I'm going to paint the other side of the antenna. When I do this, I make sure my brush isn't too loaded with paint. I'm going to use this really strong black to get some fuzz on this bumblebee. So the key to making the hair-like textures is to start your hair texture at different points and vary your length and allow there to be negative space in between. So you can kind of see those little hairs and appreciate that texture. Now there's an area here in the eye where I want to have a little bit of blue and a little bit of reflection. So I'm going to use a brush with clean water, and I'm going to do a little bit of scrubbing here inside this eye to lift out a highlight. I just used a dry paper towel to kind of dab where I lifted out some color. I also want a little bit of a highlight along the outer edge of the eye. So I'm just gently dragging a wet brush across that rim and dabbing with my paper towel to lift it out. So anywhere where I want little highlights, I am just using a wet brush with gentle pressure. I'm letting the water do the work to help pull some of that color up. And once it dries, then I can bring more color down. I'm now going to return to some of these legs here and just to start bringing them to life. So I'm going to start with the dark brown. And there's a leg behind the head here, really close to the antenna. So I'm going to start by painting it first. Trying to keep the leg width consistent. And then the end of the foot is kind of interesting. It's got a little curve to it. And then it has kind of this little Y-shaped foot. And I don't want my paint to sit in a puddle because it's going to make it hard to control where that paint goes. But I'm just starting off with the brown, and I'm going to be coming back with some blacks to add details to the leg. But I'm going to be doing this with each of the legs on this bee. So I'm going to the next leg. It's in the front. There are some brown hair-like textures on the upper portion of the thigh here. Like I said, I don't know the proper names or terms for the anatomy, but I'm just having fun here. And I'm going to add some of these browns to the chest of the bee, just below the head where it meets up with the leg. I'm going to continue using this brown for each part of the leg. And I'm just going to do my best not to run into the petal. I'm going to go to the middle leg now. I'm working on some of that fuzz texture that is on that upper thigh. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to then fill in this middle thigh here using the dark brown. I'm going to add this lower portion of the leg, which is much skinnier, so try to be careful of your pressure. Keep your pressure really light and focus on just the very end of your brush touching the paper. I'm going to continue with this little fuzz texture on this back leg. And I am going to be tinting some of that bleed-proof white with a brighter yellow for final details. So I am going to be adding some fun highlights to these legs, so I'm not too worried about the colors being dark at the moment. You could also use gouache for final details as well. Now this leg actually kicks out and is sitting on the petal here, but I'm going to choose to edit that because it kind of looks odd. So I'm just going to pretend the leg is sitting behind this petal, and not seeing the end of it kind of makes more sense to my brain. I'm going to use this dark brown to kind of emphasize some of the fuzz texture that may be at the bottom. And I can also grab some of that darker gray, and with a really light touch, being sparing, I can add some additional texture to the white butt of my bumblebee. I'm going to grab some of that dark brown and I'm going to water it down so it's not as dark. And I make sure my brush isn't too loaded. You know, I'm going to get more of that burnt sienna and water it down so it's a little more on the orange side. So with this watered down burnt sienna, I'm just going to get some fuzz texture on the yellow portion of the body. As I get out more into the yellow section, I become more sparing with how much I use that burnt sienna because I don't want to cover it all up. I'm going to do the same thing to this forward section in the bee. I'm now going to grab some of that cadmium yellow, and I'm going to paint wet on dry, and I'm going to get just a little bit of yellow hints into this back section of the bee so it reads as a separate part and it doesn't camouflage in with the flower as much. So I'm allowing there to be some whites, but I am definitely putting some yellows in there. I'm going to continue with the cadmium yellow and add some fuzz texture to the yellow sections of the bee. Some of the yellows kind of peek out on the back edge on the other side of where the wing is. I'm now going to grab some of that real dark black and add some texture to this central section of the body. And the hairs up here are mostly pointed up, but I'm trying not to completely fill it all in with solid black because I want to see some of that texture. So I'm allowing negative space in between my strokes, and I'm keeping my pressure nice and light and holding that brush vertically. I'm going to continue working with this real dark black to kind of push some of the fuzz color in areas that are dry. If the hairs are coming straight at you, consider just doing some dots, keeping your strokes a lot lighter and shorter, and that's going to help. I'm just adding a little bit of detail here to the joint of this leg. And then through the center of the leg, it gets quite dark. So I'm adding some of that black through the center, being mindful of my negative space. I'm going to do the same thing on this middle leg here. I don't want to cover up all the browns and yellows that I've maintained. I think they add a nice depth that my bee needs. So I'm just taking it nice and slow. And then I do want some black fuzz kind of in between the legs for the abdomen area. I'm going to go to the back portion of the bee and continue with my texture. I'm going to do just a few small sections of black on the very back end, but I made sure to wipe off a lot of the paint from my brush before going in here because I want these lines to be thin and wispy. I don't want them to be really wide and super dark. I need to continue to push some of the blacks in the legs to make them stand out more. So I'm going along the front edge of the leg with a nice, strong black line. And then for the rest of the leg, I'm just going to choose to kind of dab my brush, making little dots. So it kind of creates a texture there. And then I'm going to do a strong front edge to the leg. And I'm going to leave the back edge just that brown. I'm now going to go to the middle leg. And again, I'm going to do a strong black on the front section. This one is a little wider. And then on the back section, I'm just going to create little dots on top of the brown there. And this little leg has like these little tiny hairs on it. So I'm just painting a few of those in. This back leg has quite a few little fuzzes on the both front and back edge. So I'm just trying to create some subtle texture there without going into my flower. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to the joint here so it doesn't stand out so much. And there's this forward leg on the back side that I forgot about. I'm going to grab some of that black paint, wiping off the excess so I don't make really big wide marks. Mindful of where I rest my hand. I don't want to smear those blacks. And I'm going to come into this leg, add some texture to it. Now the area of the eye where I had lifted out some of the color, I'm now going to go in with a lighter ultramarine blue to give it a tint. And I don't want that blue to be too dark, but this is going to help create the illusion of a reflection. And that's just step one of the eye. So now I'm going to go into the wing, and I want to have a lot of really watered down colors on the wing. So really watered down brown that's really soft, some watered down yellow. So I'm going in and I'm not trying to actually paint specific shapes. I'm being very random with it. I just need to make sure that the colors I use are very soft and light, so it kind of looks translucent. So I used a really watered down brown black there. Now I can go in with a really watered down burnt sienna on some of it. And I need to let that wing dry so I can have a chance to come in with some other colors without it all becoming one. So I'm going to return to my real dark black. The blue on this eye has already dried. So I'm going to go around that blue oval with this black. And I'm now going to fill in a good portion of that eye, trying to maintain that thin highlight I had established at the front. I'm going to get some of the bleed-proof white. I'm going to use a clean brush, and I want to get some bright whites on the butt of my bee, just so it looks like it's overlapping. So I just dip my brush right into this. I'm going to take it over to my palette just to make sure I don't have a big glob on my brush. I want it to be loaded to a nice point. So I kind of twirl my brush and pull it. And now I can come in here and I can establish little white hairs so it looks like this back end of the bee is overlapping the center of the flower. And if I feel like I kind of got a little too heavy-handed with the other colors, using this white right now kind of helps me reestablish some of the brightness of the hairs. So I'm still being very light-handed. Now I'm going to tint this white using my cadmium yellow. So I'm just taking my brush over to the cadmium yellow watercolor that's on my palette, and I'm tinting it with the white. So I can now go into some of these forward legs, and with light pressure, I can add some little yellow hairs off the leg. I'm going to do this on each of the legs where I need it. If you enjoyed this tutorial, Please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to stick to just the back of the forward leg. I can add a little bit of this along the ridge of the eye, as long as it's dry. I can also use this color to kind of emphasize maybe some of the yellow fuzz that is at the top in case it needs to get just a little bit more. Little hairs on the legs if you want them. Now the midsection of the bee doesn't quite look as black as I'd like it, so I'm going to do another layer of black. I just really want to push my darks to be as dark as I need them for good contrast. So anywhere where you want the blacks to be just a little blacker, all right, I'm going to get some of that watered down burnt sienna. And I don't want it to be too dark because this is going on the wing. And I want to just kind of establish a few additional shapes. Again, try to be loose about it. Don't, get too tight. I'm going to go along the top edge of the wing so it looks a little darker. I have a hint of the wing behind the bee from the opposite side. So I'm using that burnt sienna to kind of add an additional wing on the back side where it kind of meets up. I need to let that dry and then I can come in with a few sparing dark brown blacks. Meanwhile, I'm going to take a look at the center of the flower and see if I can't improve some of that texture. So we kind of went with a simple texture on the first pass, but if we want to continue to push it to a more realistic effect, we need to kind of be willing to loosen up our style. So I'm going to come in here with some burnt sienna, and it's a lighter burnt sienna, and I'm just dabbing my brush to create little textures in here. I'm continuing with some of that texture on the underside of the bee. I can get some of that orange and water it down. And I can do some texture with that orange as well. Now I need to push the depth that is in between these sections of the flower. So I'm using a watered down brown and black mixture. It's not very dark. It's more of a medium gray or medium brown. Brown black. I can't talk, you guys. I need more sleep. I'm going to go in between some of these areas here. And I'm just going to give a hint of shadow. And I'm not doing it everywhere, but definitely at the ones that are pointed towards us or that are meeting up with the bottom edge of the petal. We need more depth there. All right, I'm going to return to the wing with more of those dark brownish blacks. And I want just a nice thin defined line at the top of this forward wing. And then I also want a nice defined top edge to the rear wing. If I want, I can add just a few darker shapes in the wing. Try not to actually create specific shapes. And then once that dries, I can add just a few select blacks to the wing. And then I feel like our subject will be pretty close to done. So I'm going into my dark black. I'm going to wipe it off really well on my sponge because I don't want big marks. And I'm just going to be real selective with this black. Just little bits here and there. Not going all over with it. And I feel like that finishes our little bee. I hope you learned a lot from this tutorial. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, or leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and just keep painting. Have a great day.